The information in this video is based on the most current information available at the time of production. While affordable safety training works hard to make sure these materials are current, the employer has sole responsibility for compliance with all laws, regulations, and standards. This video is sold with the understanding that AST is not providing professional or legal advice. Employers should have a reliable source for current regulatory information and best practices.
Respiratory hazards can be dangerous. Atmospheric contaminants are hard to see, difficult to identify, and can cause damage to your health over short and long periods of time. Employees sometimes don't know they are being exposed to dangerous substances until they experience health problems. Some common work practices can cause exposure to hazardous atmospheric contaminants. Each year, over 5 million workers use respirators to protect themselves from hazards in the workplace. Many workers get sick or even die by not using respirators when they should. Over 66,000 workers a year suffer from illness related to exposure. The use of respirators in the workplace is covered by OSHA 29 CFR 1910.134. This regulation outlines the requirements for both workers and employers. This respiratory protection regulation opens with this very important statement. In the control of those occupational diseases caused by breathing air contaminated with harmful dusts, fogs, fumes, mists, gases, smokes, sprays, or vapors, the primary objective shall be to prevent atmospheric contamination. This shall be accomplished as far as feasible by accepted engineering control measures. For example, enclosure or confinement of the operation, general and local ventilation, and substitution of less toxic materials. When effective engineering controls are not feasible, or while they are being instituted, appropriate respirators shall be used pursuant to this section. This is OSHA's way of saying that respirators should only be used as a last resort. Once an atmospheric contaminant has been identified, the employer must use engineering controls to remove the hazard. If this is not possible, then, and only then, can the employer require employees to use respirators. Eliminating the hazard is always the preferred method for protecting employees. Employers have the following respiratory protection requirements. They must identify, evaluate, and mitigate respiratory hazards in the workplace. Develop a written respiratory protection program. Provide a medical screening and a respirator fit test. Select and provide appropriate respirators based on the workplace hazards. And they must provide training on proper respirator selection, use, maintenance, and cleaning. Employees have the following requirements. They must complete a medical screening, pass a fit test on the exact size and type of respirator they will be using, complete respiratory protection training, use respirators when required, clean and store respirators properly. Finally, they must report any new respiratory hazards to a supervisor. The employer must survey the work area to identify respiratory hazards, and develop a reasonable estimate of potential employee exposure. The sampling must be representative of exposure levels, time, and working conditions. Check the safety data sheets for information on potential respiratory hazards. This analysis should be done by an appropriately trained person. If there is no one at the company who is trained on atmospheric analysis, the employer will need to bring in a professional. Free assistance may be available from your workman's compensation insurance carrier, or a local OSHA office. The preferred method for dealing with atmospheric hazards is eliminating them with engineering controls. Requiring PPE is always the last resort, to be used if the hazards cannot be eliminated. Removing the hazard can be accomplished by changing materials, adding ventilation, isolating the employee from the work area, or many other methods. If it is not feasible to eliminate the hazard, then respirators can be used. Always try to eliminate the hazard first, before you require employees to use respirators. Employees must be evaluated by a medical professional to determine if they are able to wear a respirator. OSHA requires employees to complete a medical questionnaire. It will be reviewed by a qualified healthcare professional. Employees may not use respirators until they pass a medical screening. This medical evaluation needs to be repeated if the type of respirator, work conditions, or health information listed on the medical screening change. The company is required to have a written respiratory protection program that includes procedures for selecting respirators, employee medical evaluations, respirator fit tests, respirator use, cleaning and maintenance procedures, procedures for supplying high-quality air to atmosphere providing respirators, employee training on respiratory hazards and respirator use, and procedures for program evaluation. This policy must be available to all employees, and must be included as part of the company training. Even if exposure levels do not require respirators, employers may allow voluntary use of respirators at an employee's request. If voluntary use is permitted, employees must be provided with a copy of Appendix D of the OSHA Respiratory Protection Standard. There are many different kinds of respirators, cartridges and accessories. It is important to select a respirator that is designed to protect against the atmospheric hazard that is present in the work area. Air purifying respirators use filters or chemicals to remove contaminants from the air. Unless powered, the air is passed through the filter with the force of the user's breath. This can lower the effectiveness of an employee by increasing the energy that is required to breathe. Air purifying respirators will not work in low oxygen environments. Powered air purifying respirators use a motor to draw air through a filter. These respirators are easier on the user, and provide a higher level of protection. Air supplying respirators provide fresh air to the user from a clean source. They can be used in low oxygen environments. Air supplying respirators are required for atmospheres that are immediately dangerous to life and health. The self-contained breathing apparatus, or SCBA, is an example of a type of atmosphere-providing respirator. Respirators are categorized as positive pressure and negative pressure. Positive pressure respirators draw air into the mask from an air supply, and create a small positive pressure under the mask. Powered air purifying respirators, atmosphere-providing respirators, and SCBAs, are examples of positive pressure respirators. Negative pressure respirators use the force of the user's breath to draw in air, and create a small negative pressure inside the mask. Air purifying respirators and disposable masks are negative pressure type respirators. The assigned protection factor is the level of protection a respirator is expected to provide. Respirators are rated by their APFs. The higher the APF, the stronger the protection. Always know the APF of the respirator that you are using. A half-mask, air purifying respirator has an APF of 10, which means it will reduce the level of contamination by a factor of 10. A full facepiece air purifying respirator has an assigned protection factor of 50. A full facepiece powered air purifying respirator has a assigned protection factor of 1000. The maximum use concentration is the highest level of contamination an employee can work in, with the type of respirator that they will be using. The maximum use concentration is the assigned protection factor, multiplied by the permissible exposure level of the atmospheric contaminant. Let's take a look at an example. The assigned protection factor for a full facepiece, air purifying respirator is 50. The permissible exposure limit for lead is 50 micrograms per cubic meter. By multiplying the assigned protection factor and the permissible exposure limit, we get a maximum use concentration of 2,500 micrograms per cubic meter. Employees wearing this type of respirator cannot work in a space with a level of lead higher than this concentration. Knowing the assigned protection factor, the level of exposure in the work area, and the maximum use concentration is an essential part of using respiratory protection. The N, P, and R ratings on a respirator or respirator cartridge describe how they handle atmospheric contaminants that contain oil. N stands for not oil resistant, R stands for oil resistant, and P stands for oil proof. Remember that N stands for not resistant to oil, and should only be used to protect from particulates. Filter efficiencies are listed as part of their rating. It is usually listed next to the oil designator. A P95 respirator is oil-proof and 95% efficient. Filters with higher efficiencies provide better protection, but are more difficult to breathe through. The P100 on this filter means it is oil-proof, with a 100% efficiency. It can be tempting to just use the highest rated respirator you can find, but remember that higher filter ratings are tougher to breathe through and can affect the ability of a worker to safely perform their task. Pick a respirator that is appropriate for the hazard and the work conditions. Air purifying respirators have different types of cartridges for different hazards. Select the proper cartridge for the environment. Cartridges are color-coded based on the type of contaminants they filter. There are many different types of respirator cartridges. Green is for ammonia, purple is for particulates, white is for acid gas, black is for organic. Cartridges also come in combinations, such as the one for particulates and organic vapor. Be sure to select the cartridge type that matches the atmospheric hazard in the work area. Cartridges wear out at different rates, depending on the time of use and concentrations of contaminants. If there is no end-of-life indicator on the cartridge, it must be changed on a regular schedule. You should put the change schedule where it is visible to employees, and supervisors should remind employees to change them at the designated times. Respirators and accessories must be certified by the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. Check for the NIOSH logo on all respiratory equipment. Employees must complete the appropriate qualitative or quantitative fit test, as required by the type of respirator. They must be fit tested with the same make, model, style, and size of the respirator that they will use in the workplace. The employer must provide several different types of respirators for employees to choose from, so they can find the one that best fits their face. There are two types of fit tests. Qualitative fit tests use a smoke or smelling agent to perform a pass-no-pass test of the respirator seal. Quantitative fit tests use a machine to measure the exact amount of leakage into the respirator. Qualitative fit tests are allowed for all positive pressure respirators. A qualitative fit test may only be used for negative pressure respirators where a protection factor of 10 or less is required. Let's take a look at an example. If you have a permissible exposure limit of 5 parts per million, multiply that by the protection factor of 10, to get 50 parts per million. If you are using a negative pressure respirator and the contamination level is 50 parts per million or less, you can use a qualitative fit test. If it is greater than 50 parts per million, you must use a quantitative fit test. Fit tests must be repeated when a different size or type of respirator is used. There are changes in the employee's physical condition that affects fit. Atmospheric hazards change, or a year has passed since the last fit test. Not all employees can wear respirators. Some workers will have medical conditions that make using respirators unsafe. Some employees will not be able to get a good seal on a respirator due to face shape or other physical characteristics. The fit test is a critical part of ensuring a respirator adequately protects employees from atmospheric hazards. An atmosphere that is immediately dangerous to life and health is one that poses an immediate threat to life, would cause irreversible health effects, or impairs an individual's ability to escape. Environments with low oxygen, or with contamination levels that cannot be determined, are assumed to be IDLH. Employees working in IDLH atmospheres must use a full face piece pressure demand (SCBA) certified for a minimum service life of 30 minutes, or a combination full face piece pressure demand supplied air respirator, with an auxiliary self-contained air supply. One or more employees must be located outside the IDLH area that are authorized and designated by the employer. This person maintains communication with employees in the space, and are trained and equipped to perform rescue in the space. Work in IDLH atmospheres is extremely dangerous and should only be performed by specialists trained on this type of work. Employees must know the types and concentrations of contaminants in the workplace. The company respiratory protection program will have this information. Employees should also be familiar with the safety data sheet for each contaminant. Using engineering controls to eliminate the hazard is the preferred method for respiratory protection. The employee should see if ventilation or other engineering controls can be used to eliminate the hazard. Respirators should only be used if the hazard cannot be eliminated. Too often, employees default to using respirators when a simple change in work process or addition of ventilation can eliminate the hazard. Every employee must complete training before using a respirator. This training will be provided by the employer and must include why the respirator is necessary, how improper fit, usage, or maintenance can compromise safety, the capabilities and limitations of the respirator, using the respirator in emergency situations, what to do if a respirator malfunctions, how to inspect a respirator, putting on and removing a respirator, how to perform seal checks, procedures for maintenance and storage, recognizing medical signs and symptoms that may limit or prevent the effective use of respirators. The general requirements of the OSHA Respiratory Protection Standard. Select a respirator type with the appropriate assigned protection factor for the work area. Select a filter and cartridge type that is appropriate for the hazard. A supervisor will provide guidance on selecting the correct respirator. Remember that you must be fit test on the exact size and type of respirator that you are using. Prior to each use, inspect your respirator in accordance with the manufacturer's guidelines. Check for cracks, rips, dirt, or distortions. Check the valves for damage. Check that the straps are not torn and have good elasticity. Check all plastic parts for cracking and wear. Remove the exhalation valve cover and check for dirt or damage. You must inspect your respirator before each use. If using supplied air, verify that there is a sufficient supply. Make sure the air is drawn from a clean, uncontaminated source. Check that it is connected correctly. Place the respirator on the nose and mouth, and pull the harness over the crown of your head. Hook the bottom straps behind the back of the head. Position on the face. Tighten the top straps first, then the bottom straps. Do not pull the straps too tight. It should make a seal, but not be uncomfortable. After donning, perform seal checks. For a positive seal check, block off the exhalation valve and exhale gently into the face piece. There should be a slight increase of positive pressure, without any outward leakage at the seal. For most respirators, you must remove the exhalation valve cover to perform the positive pressure test. For the negative pressure test, cover the air inlet openings. Inhale gently, so that the face piece collapses. Hold your breath for 10 seconds. If there is no inward leakage of air, the seal is working. Working while wearing a respirator will limit your effectiveness. It makes it harder to breathe, and it can make you hot and tired. Practice wearing a respirator before starting work tasks. Take frequent breaks, and do not overexert yourself. Monitor the cartridges, and make sure they are changed according to the schedule, or when the end-of-life indicator requires it. For supplied air systems, monitor the air supply and the quality of air. While working, keep a close eye on the work environment. Watch for changes in conditions or atmospheric contaminants. If a new hazard is detected, or atmospheric concentrations are unexpectedly high, exit the area immediately. Breakthrough occurs when contaminants get through a respirator. This can happen with an expired cartridge, loss of seal, or a sudden increase in hazard levels. In supplied air systems, the air supply source could also become contaminated. When breakthrough occurs, the worker may feel dizzy, tired, or nauseated. An odor may be detected. Keep in mind that many chemicals do not produce a notable odor. The safety data sheets explain the symptoms of exposure for each chemical. Be familiar with them, the information may save your life. The worker should leave the hazard area if breakthrough is detected, if there is a change in breathing resistance, or signs of leakage past the seal. Cartridges and filters should be replaced outside the work area. Leave the work area to wash hands and face as necessary. Never remove your respirator in the work area, always go to an established clean area when personal protection must be removed. Respirators should be cleaned and disinfected as often as necessary. Respirators must be cleaned before use by another employee. Emergency respirators should be cleaned after every use. To clean a respirator, remove cartridges, filters, and canisters. Disassemble the components. Wash in warm water with the appropriate cleaner. Use a stiff brush to remove dirt. Rinse in warm water and dry with a lint-free cloth. Reassemble and make sure all components work properly. Be sure to check the manufacturer's instructions for specific cleaning requirements. Respirators must be stored in a way that protects them from damage, contamination, excessive moisture, damaging chemicals, and deformation. Even just leaving a respirator in direct sunlight can cause the plastic to harden and crack. Make sure they are stored in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. Respirator maintenance should only be performed by appropriately trained persons. All repair parts must be NIOSH approved. Valves, regulators, alarms, and other critical components should only be repaired by the manufacturer. If a respirator requires repair, it usually is just easier to purchase a new one. Now let's briefly summarize some key points. The preferred method for dealing with respiratory hazards is eliminating them with engineering controls. Only after those methods are exhausted, can respirators be required. Employers must have a written respiratory protection program in place. Workers must be screened by a medical professional before being permitted to use a respirator. Users must be fit tested on the exact size and type of respirator they will be wearing. Respirators must be inspected prior to each use. Only trained employees may use respirators, and they must be retrained at least once a year. The employer will provide appropriate respiratory protection for the work area. Atmospheric contaminants can be dangerous. Be sure to follow the requirements of your company respiratory protection program, so you can go home safe and healthy each day.